We all have blind spots when it comes to things we enjoy. Those areas of our taste which are maybe a little bit more suspect than the things we share with our friends and family most of the time. For those of us who enjoy music, there is always the song or album which sits to one side of our music collection. We regard it as something of a guilty pleasure. For example, I have here a vinyl copy of the classic 1980s album Welcome to the Pleasure Dome by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. This is something part of me cringes about, while simultaneously believing that this album is possibly the high point of 80s pop music. When it comes to entertainment, we all have some sort of guilty pleasure tucked away somewhere. I have a number of friends who enjoy reading fiction that is generally described as historical romance. It is a guilty pleasure in that historical romance is a genre that relies upon intrigue and scandal. The plot in a good historical romance often intertwines stories of sex, politics, and religion. It's that magical combination of all three that sends these books flying up the bestseller lists. Incidentally, it is that combination of sex, politics, and religion that also makes this a brilliant album. Maybe more the sex part. Despite the claim that in polite company it is best to avoid discussing the topics of sex, politics, and religion, those three topics command our attention time and time again. They are ever present in television and films, books, and news stories. They are there throughout our history because we tend to have long memories where scandal is concerned. In fact, there is a collection of children's books published under the title Horrible Histories, which have enticed children into reading them by promising that these are history lessons with all the nasty bits left in. Certainly enticing to my children. As President Roosevelt's mischievous daughter once said, "If you haven't got anything nice to say about anybody, then come and sit next to me." The fact that the Gospel of Mark records the scandal of the death of John the Baptist is not surprising in one sense. It was clearly a scandal involving sex, politics, and religion. And yet, the inclusion of this story seems to be at odds with the rest of the gospel narrative. I say this because the Gospel of Mark is primarily concerned with the ministry of Jesus. Yet the passage we have just heard interrupts that narrative in order to include the salacious story of sex, politics, and religion. It's like opening a copy of Sense and Sensibility only to discover that you're actually reading 50 Shades of Grey. In today's reading, we are told that John had offended Herod through being critical of Herod's relationship with his brother's wife. It is implied by the text that John believed that marrying your sibling's wife was prohibited by the laws found in the book of Leviticus. It would seem that John had been openly critical of Herod for entering into a relationship that he regarded as incestuous. This criticism went far deeper than sexual relationships or even marriage relationships. It was also a criticism of Herod as a political and religious leader. John's point was that Herod's choice in this matter was inconsistent with Jewish practice and was unbecoming of a would-be monarch. Herod's decision to imprison John was due to the fact that John was undermining his political ambitions. Despite being a puppet of the Roman Empire, Herod was also a Jewish leader who longed for the recognition and support of his own people. John was a thorn in his side, reminding him that while he longed for the adulation of his own people, he would not get it as long as he was embracing lifestyle choices like that of the oppressors. Herod was caught between two worlds. He wanted to be a voice for his own people, and yet the Romans had given him a life of opulence that was highly seductive. For John, such ambivalence showed that Herod was neither a good Jew nor a good king. John wanted his political leader to be better and was prepared to say so. The story of John and Herod and the party where a drunken promise cost John his life certainly catches our attention. It is a scandalous end to what had been a scandalous conflict. Yet I'm left wondering about the purpose of this story within the gospel. Why did the writers of Mark write the story down at all? Perhaps the inclusion of this story is simply a reminder that our spiritual lives are lived out in a wider context. Spirituality is not something that simply belongs within our private lives, but must be engaged with all aspects of life. The hard lesson here is that the gospel compels us to do the right thing, even when it's uncertain whether doing the right thing will make a difference. John's calling as a prophet compelled him to speak the truth, even when doing so proved to be costly. To many, John's choice to confront Herod, knowing that the outcome was unlikely to be positive, can appear idiotic. There seems to be little sense to such a course of action. Interestingly, the word idiotic has not always meant stupid or foolish, or maybe in the case of John, cavalier. The ancient Athenians used the word idiotus as a description of a person who was indifferent to public affairs. If we are to take that original meaning of the word, it's clear that it doesn't describe John at all. His religious beliefs inspired him to care deeply about public affairs. Perhaps this is why the scandal appears in the gospel. It is a reminder that following God requires us to care deeply about all areas of life, from private to public. God is concerned with injustice and power structures that benefit some while harming many. We are incredibly fortunate in that we live in a society where we can speak freely, where leaders can be called to account without threat to our personal safety. The true intent of freedom of speech is not to say hateful things without consequence, but rather it is to hold the powerful to account. And yet, even though the political climate in which we live is far less hostile than the climate in which John practiced his ministry, we are often indifferent to public affairs, indifferent to using our freedom to speak against injustice. With each election that comes to pass in this country, both general and local, voter turnout declines every time. While I accept that in a democracy people have the right to choose apathy, as followers of the gospel, we are called to resist such apathy. Karl Marx made a famous criticism of religion when he described it as the opium of the people, with a clear suggestion that religion can make us pliable and submissive. There is a degree of truth to that claim. At its worst, religion can lull people into a state of contentment with the status quo, rather than inspiring them to transform the world for the better. As followers of Christ, we too often hold back our opinions out of an overdeveloped phobia of causing offence. As Anglicans, we really value being polite, sometimes to our detriment. By doing so, we are betraying the part of our heritage that affirms that a good and healthy society is one that cares for those in need, the broken, the lonely, the homeless, the sick, and the refugee. These are the values we are called to speak out on. If upholding those values causes offence to the powerful, maybe it's time we commit ourselves to being more offensive. Amen.